Welcome. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the September astrology forecast on the Astrology and Magic channel. We'll talk about the astrology of September. First, I wanted to say thank you very much to all of my patrons. All of you, you know who you are. Thank you for all of your support. If you would like to become a patron and get early access to my astrology videos and also access to exclusive videos that never get made available to the public, also our monthly Q&A and the monthly Magical Elections ebook, you can go to patreon.com/Nina Griffin. Let's get started with the forecast. We have a lot to go through. I gave this month the theme of struggle and victory. And this is because we have quite a few pretty intense aspects. A lot of them involve the so-called superior planets. If you're not familiar, these are the planets Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the classical sense that are superior of the sun because they're slower than the sun. And essentially, these planets are the ones that make changes in large groups of people, in nations, in states, in large organizations. Whenever something big happens, you know that the superior planets are operating and doing their thing. So this month really starts off with a bang. September 1st, we get a full moon at 10 degrees Pisces. Now, this is not a super active chart when you cast a chart for this full moon. It's ruled by Jupiter because he, of course, rules Pisces, the sign where the moon is for this full moon. And Jupiter is very afflicted right now, right? He's retrograde, he's in his fall, he's with Saturn, he's with Pluto, he's being squared by Mars. He's not in good shape. So what I would say the theme of the next 2 weeks would be the first half of September for all of us, both on a global scale or national scale, as well as on a personal level. I would say that we are all challenged to do more with less for the next couple of weeks. Now, I think this is something we really had to deal with all of this year as Jupiter passed through Capricorn and all of the afflictions that are in Capricorn for planets this year. But in general, we're going to really have that theme driven home. So you also might see some of the kind of afflicted behavior of Jupiter right now. And the way that that usually manifests when he's not in good shape is you might see empty promises or unjustified optimism. Given that Jupiter is in a Saturn sign, I think you're going to see more of a withholding of Jupiter's blessings because it's for your own good, that kind of thing. Just remember, he only has a few more months left in Capricorn. It's kind of amazing how fast his time in Capricorn has passed. But really, in December, he's going to move into Aquarius, so we're really just looking at a few more months. However, the next couple of weeks are going to be fairly intense Jupiter in Capricorn time. The very next day, September 2nd, Venus will oppose Saturn at 25 Cancer in Capricorn. What I think that might bring is, remember how Venus, when she went retrograde, everybody either started going completely crazy in terms of socializing and pretending that COVID didn't exist and it wasn't a problem. And then we also, on top of all that, saw the BLM protests, everything like that in the United States. Venus is really a way of connecting with other people. It's really the part of being social that we enjoy. It's the reason that we live in society. Yes, it's practical, but we also, we're wired to want to be around others to a lesser or greater extent. Certainly we depend on other people. What I think this might bring, this Venus opposite Saturn, is I think some places, depending on where you are in the world, might start locking down again. Venus, remember, is about connecting with others. So when she opposes Saturn, she runs into the wall. Basically, that is COVID. Obviously, Saturn takes on different roles over the years. It's very clear that this year, and possibly in some future years, Saturn is going to be COVID. So isolation and limitation are going to be Venus's afflictions, especially during that first week of September. Now, September 4th, Venus moves on, and she will square Mars. This is at 27 Cancer in Aries, and really, we get more of a battle vibe rather than isolation and restriction. Note that in this particular square, Mars is superior, so he's going to be a tough competitor, but don't forget, Mars and Venus are both fighting off Saturn at the same time. So it's kind of like Venus and Mars are in a skirmish, but both of them are actually involved in the same larger war with a third party or a third force. So I think what you're going to be seeing is you have Venus, who are the people who want inclusion, who want to be around others, whether it's for good or bad, right? You could be looking at things like, people's rights to be included. But also, do I have the right to be around other people when I could be giving them germs or the virus, right? But then, of course, this is all happening in the context of fighting COVID. So Mars is going to be, I think, probably a lot of the political inflammatory stuff that we've been feeling a lot of this year. And that's really seeming to be coming to a head this fall. But I also, in a larger sense, as I had mentioned in a previous video about Venus, these two transits of Venus, opposition to Saturn and square to Mars, it's really the culmination of this 10-day period of conflict and challenge that Venus is experiencing. My suspicion is that despite the tangling with Mars, Venus ultimately comes out victorious because she passes from these difficult aspects right into Royal Leo. And especially if this year your Time Lord is Venus, definitely watch her transits around this time. So I think it's going to be a really crucial period for you. Now, September 4th, also Mercury will sextile Venus. This is at 28 Virgo, 28 Cancer. And I would call this artful battle. So you've got Venus sort of fighting Mars on the one hand, fighting Saturn on the other hand through the opposition, but then she's getting a really powerful assist from Mercury, who's in his own sign and exaltation in Virgo. He will lend Venus his cleverness and his skill and his invention. Mars, on the other hand, has no such support at this time. So I think it's going to be a really interesting period, that first week of September, where people are locked in all kinds of disputes and combat and arguments, and then Venus gets this really interesting and in some ways sort of unexpected assist from Mercury. We'll talk a little bit about what Mercury could mean, but to start thinking about what kinds of people are ruled by Mercury. So in the second week of September, the Sun will trine Jupiter retrograde. Now, this isn't a super powerful aspect, especially because Jupiter now is stationing direct, so he doesn't have a lot of power when he's stationary. But I do think that the Sun trine promises a future improvement. And so because Jupiter always very shortly goes direct after this trine to the Sun, he's essentially sort of starting to gain some strength, starting to gain some energy. And of course, Jupiter going direct has a very special meaning. Now, he actually goes direct September 12th, so the same week, so 3 days after this trine. He will be at 17 Capricorn. So if you have any sensitive points in your chart around that area, around the middle of the cardinal signs, especially Capricorn, to some extent Cancer as well, I think we're going to start seeing some real changes in the world around now. Now remember, he's been retrograde since May 14th, so quite a long time, really 4 months. And this was really around the time that the world generally started to open up, right after all those lockdowns this spring, regardless of COVID risks. Some places could do it sort of with a clean conscience, and then everybody else thought, well, we can do it too. We don't have the numbers, but we'll do it anyway. What happened, of course, in the last few months is that lessons had to be relearned, right? If you didn't do your homework the right way the first time around, well, you got handed it right back and you just had to go and redo it, hopefully until you learn it correctly this time. Now, because Jupiter is going direct now, I think what we'll see is a whole new set of lessons, again about making do with less, but also about making something good out of no resources at all. And this could be on a personal level in terms of prosperity, right? Lots of people lost their incomes, lost money. It's been a very difficult time financially, and it will continue to be so. What I think we will also see is that the countries that have done a really good job so far of avoiding job losses, so a lot of the EU where they just said, look, we'll pay employers, kind of the full amount of people's salaries, just keep people on the payroll. Well, a lot of those places are not really safe to reopen, right? I mean, they're kind of opened in a limited capacity. But what we're starting to see is a lot of those places are going to start losing those jobs because this assistance was never intended to last for a year or even 2 years, which is as long as we might need to deal with this virus really thoroughly, right? So I think what we're going to start seeing this fall is the places that kind of had their, financial suffering put on hold are going to have to deal with that and come to terms with it, and potentially they're going to start seeing some of those negative financial consequences that were sort of put on hold by Jupiter and Saturn being retrograde. Now, September 17th and that whole week, we actually get two, what I would say, nearly simultaneous aspects. September 17th, Mercury squares Jupiter. So I think we're going to see some big legal cases now, important legal decisions such as antitrust cases, criminal cases, all sorts of things, as well as disputes that affect education. Now, Mercury, as you can probably tell, it has everything to do with students. Jupiter is more about higher education and the courts and the legal system. So I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing some really intense, particularly legal battles about, who gets to go to school and what does equitable education look like, and do we just close schools down? It's really going to start rolling as all the schools reopen in late August and in early and mid-September. That same day, just a few hours later, the new moon at 25 Virgo occurs. So again, this will set the tone for the following 2 weeks, so the second half of September. And this is a pretty, I would call, uneventful new moon all by itself. It's at Virgo, it's trine these Capricorn planets. So the way that I see the next 2 months is that, the next 2 weeks I should say, you're going to get a lot of support of forces that resist Mars's aggression. If you haven't yet watched my Mars square Saturn videos, I recommend that you go do that, because you'll see that Mars represents the forces that are being aggressive and pushy and very vocal this fall, right? Saturn represents the resistance. It represents the wall. Now, what that means for you or in your particular location will vary, but those are generally the dynamics we're seeing. So with this new moon though, because the new moon is trine Saturn, Saturn essentially gets a refuel opportunity, right? Virgo in particular has to do with food, it has to do with sustenance. And so there's going to be some much needed food and moral support given to Saturn during Mars's siege of Saturn at this time. Week 4 is very active. It's amazing. September just does not let up. September 22nd, the Sun enters Libra, which is our Libra ingress of this fall. Here, the Sun loses dignity. He goes into his fall, and Venus is now going to be in generosity with the Sun. Generosity is basically being in each other's major dignity without the benefit of an aspect. So I can think of it as mutual reception light. Now, Venus and the Sun depend on each other now, right? I could think of this as the combination of the king and an important female figure are very interdependent, but she is stronger because the Sun is in his fall. So there is this sense of sort of these two people locked in some kind of interdependent relationship, whether it's positive or negative. They need each other, right? But they just don't have a really good way of, he doesn't have a good way of supporting her, but she's kind of the more powerful one in this relationship. September 23rd, Mercury will square Saturn. That's at 25 Libra and Capricorn, which actually isn't a terrible combination for Mercury. He is on the fixed star Spica at 24 Libra, and he is received by Saturn and then dominates Saturn as well. So symbolically, this is pretty major, right? I think that this week is going to bring a, public or not public alliance between big wealth, because Mercury and Libra on Spica really is a very commercial placement. It's all about money. It's all about the goods of this world that are provided. And the defenders of the castle, whoever the resistance is, they are allied with Mercury now. So I could see that Mercury maybe provides some much needed funding to Saturn, even though it's a square. It's not an easy relationship, but at the same time, it's going to be some kind of, maybe quid pro quo kind of thing. I certainly would not want to be Mars now. I will tell you that. Mars is at a severe disadvantage, and I think this part of September will really, really bring that into the mix. We will see some involvement with students. Again, with Mercury, I think students are just as important here as big business. What I could see here is that schools will have to close en masse to prevent the spread of COVID, right? There maybe is a realization that we have to do something in order to prevent the spread of this disease. And so what do? Now, Mercury squares Saturn. And the reason that they do so is because, well, it's illness, right? So you have this issue of Saturn as prevention, but it's also symbolic of the disease itself. Now, September 24th, Mercury will oppose Mars. This is at 26 Libra and Aries. Mars is really between, say, a rock and a hard place, and he really is being crushed from two sides. So the reason is that he's really Mars is getting squished by Mercury as well as by Saturn. This is a very uncomfortable place for Mars to be. He already experienced this with Venus, but I think that Mercury in some ways is going to be even tougher because of Mercury's positive relationship in some ways with Saturn. Then September 27th, after all this intense drama and pressure on Mars, Mercury enters Scorpio. Very different flavor than Libra. Remember, Scorpio is a mute sign. And so the battle that heretofore has been very verbal, it goes nonverbal. It goes underground. And it gets, frankly, a lot more dangerous and toxic. Scorpio is the sign of poison. And therefore, it was a sign that was very active, actually, when COVID first emerged in China. And it has everything to do with disease, but it also has to do with conversations around topics that are taboo. And so I think what you're going to start seeing is, this is, I would say, the digging up of dirt. It's kind of amazing. In the United States, we have this thing in election year called the October surprise, where each party sort of tries to dig up some shocking piece of dirt on their opponents and tries to present it in October in time for it to sink in before the election in early November. And with Mercury entering Scorpio, I can't help but think that we're going to see something like at least an attempted October surprise. Now, we do have a few more days left, so week 5, essentially, of September. September 28th, we have Venus trine Mars at 25 Leo and Aries. So this seems like a very positive development. There's connection with others, but with energy, obviously, because Mars is involved. And it almost seems like a way to collaborate with others and get them to do what you want through charm, right? It doesn't seem like a negative time, depending on, I guess, what your goals are. At the same time, on the 28th, Saturn will go direct at 25 Capricorn. So again, moving on from May, starting, I would say, what I would call the last and final installment of the Capricorn story that we've experienced the last 2.5 years. So if you're having your Saturn return and you have a natal Saturn in Capricorn, you're almost there. You have just a few more months left. And then Saturn will be in Aquarius and you won't have to deal with this for another 29 or so years. So that's pretty nice. What that means for the rest of us, though, is that as Saturn enters into a different sign, it's the end of an era, right? These are short eras. They're only about 2.5 years long. But, it's one of those things where you end a chapter in world history and we're now on to something completely different. If you're interested in learning more about Saturn in Aquarius, I recommend you go to my website, ninagriffin.com. There is a lengthy article there about Saturn in Aquarius and the kinds of influences that he's going to bring during his time there. So you have a few months to really get ready. Obviously, we had just a tiny taste of Saturn in Aquarius earlier this year, but now it's going to be there for good. September 29th is when Mars retrograde squares Saturn. So this is the second of the 3 Mars-Saturn squares. This happens at 25 Aries and Capricorn, and it's really a development or maybe a further complexity in the story that we saw in late August when Mars first squared Saturn. So whatever happens around August 24th goes back for a second act. And I think that this is a lot of this aspect, as I had mentioned, I think it was back in, June, July. It's been a few months now. I mentioned it's going to take a long time. for the American people to get any kind of financial support out of Congress. I had said at the time it would be September or October, and I think that's still the case. I didn't see it happening any earlier than that, and I think a lot of it has to do with this Mars retrograde square Saturn, Mars moving very slowly. There's just not a lot of forward motion, not a lot of impetus to try to fix problems, right? So a lot of the aggression is sort of turned into inappropriate channels, but it's not really focused on moving forward, on doing what needs to be done. So what's interesting though, at the end of September, what's different than in October or in August, Mars, I wouldn't say he had the upper hand, but he had a lot of momentum, right? That square, this is the first time that the army just like rocks up to the walls of the city that they're going to besiege, and they're looking all shiny and spiffy and just ready to fight. What happens is they get repulsed because Saturn, of course, is more powerful than Mars here. So at the end of September, Mars retrograde again tries to knock at the gates, or rather down the wall of Saturn. But now the tables are turned, right? Mars is retrograde on its back foot, and Saturn is direct. So this is almost like the wall sort of actively punches back, or at least sort of crushes Mars, if that makes sense. Mars was thinking this was going to be easy. He just needs to do this a few times and he wins, right? But no, this is actually Saturn like doing some Saturn stuff to Mars. I think it's going to be quite fascinating, and depending on who the Mars people in our lives and on the national and international stage are, I think they're going to be in for what I would call a somewhat rude awakening at this time. This is a major, major date with reality for Mars. This is the reason I was telling you several months ago, if you are going to take on a role this fall, don't be Mars. Don't be the person who's trying to fight things and who's trying to tell others what to do and who's trying to kind of shout their way through confrontations, because Saturn will, he will kick your butt, right? So this is not a good time to take on that aggressive Mars role. And the end of September is really when that happens. All right, so this is it for the September astrology forecast. I'm Nina Griffin. Thank you very much for watching.